I welcome you all in this lecture series called Mehboob Haque Lecture, which is in the memory of great Dr. Mehboob Haque. The chairperson of this session will be Dr. Ishrat Hussain, who did his PhD from Boston University, and after working with World Bank, he was appointed as Governor of State Bank of Pakistan in 2000. After that, he has served as Dean at IBA from 2008 to 2016 and currently have chair at Center of Excellence in Islamic Finance. President of Pakistan conferred Nishan-e-Imtiaz upon him in 2006 for his outstanding services for Pakistan. Sir, kindly. The speaker for this session will be Dr. Nadeem Haque, who served as a deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of Pakistan and also held various other positions. He received his PhD from University of Chicago in 1986 and joined World Bank. After IMF, yes. IMF. In from 2002 and 2004, he served as senior resident representative of the IMF in Egypt. He also served as Vice Chancellor PIDE till 2007, and he is author of various books, and his current book, which is published recently, is called How Pakistan Became an Asian Tiger by 2050. Sir, kindly please, if you come. The discussants for this session will be Dr. Hamza Ali Malik, who joined UNESCAP in November 2014 and is currently working as Chief of Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis, where his main responsibility is to lead assessment of economic condition and development challenges of the Asia-Pacific region and prepare the economic and social survey on Asia and its Pacific. Please, if doctors have come on stage. The second discussant will be Dr. Muhammad Waheed, who works in World Bank as an macroeconomic and fiscal management global practice. Sir, if you kindly come to stage. Dr. Waheed. Third discussant will be Dr. Wasim Shahid Malik, who is serving as an State Bank of Pakistan chair professor in the University of Balochistan. Dr. Wasim has served as an assistant professor in School of Economics in Quaid-e-Azam University as well. And his areas of academic interest are macroeconomic, monetary policy, and economic modeling. Sir, if you please. Now I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Ishrat Hussain.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at this very prestigious conference. This is one of matter of pride that despite all the ups and downs in Pakistan, the PIDE deserves our gratitude and commendation for continuing with this tradition of annual conference, which is of very high quality, attracting professionals from all over the world and particularly from Pakistan. This lecture is in the memory of Dr. Mehboob Haque, and let me pay my personal tribute to Dr. Mehboob Haque, who has really done a tremendous job, not only for projecting Pakistan, but also making a paradigm shift in the thinking about economic development by introducing, along with Amartya Sen, the concept of the Human Development Index. And today, whatever we are harvesting is because of the pioneering efforts of Dr. Mahbubul Haq. Pakistan, I don't think, has produced anybody of the same caliber as Dr. Mahbubul Haq. And I hope the youngsters who are present here will try to emulate his example and try to become not only one Mahbubul Haq, but many Mahbubul Haqs in the world. The speaker for this particular occasion is quite well known in Pakistan, but he is also international credentials. And he has been a very vocal critic of the whole apparatus through which we formulate our policies, the influence of the external donors, the lack of indigenous research, and the relationship between research and policy making. And I think he's the most qualified person to provoke a lot of discussions. And I think he will also give us some constructive ideas as to how we can improve this interaction between research and the policy making. We are already a few minutes late, so I won't take much of your time. I have come here mostly to listen to the speaker and to the panelists. So without much ado, let me invite Dr. Nadeem Haq to present his Mahbubul Haq lecture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, PIDE organization and staff. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be presenting the Mahbubul Haq lecture. Unlike Ishrat, I never had the honor of meeting Mahbubul Haq, but I'm a great admirer of Dr. Haq. I think he's the single most important economist Pakistan has produced, and Ishrat just spoke about that. His importance lies in two things. One, he gave us the planning and the policy with which to do our initial economic planning. His strategy for economic planning is a very important book, and I urge all of you to read it even today. He talked about how we should look for aid, have enough funding, and then, based on the models at that time, how we should try and build infrastructure and try and fill the financing gap and grow. So I won't go into that, but that was a major achievement of his. But then the other more important achievement that Mahbubul Haq had was that he was in the policy and economic discourse in Pakistan. Even taxi drivers knew his name. His 22 families thesis stuck everywhere. This was a fame and an effectiveness that I think all of us envy, and we've never reached that. I don't think any economist since Mahbubul Haq has reached that. And one of the things that I confront when I started thinking about the Mahbubul Haq lecture, what has happened to the economics profession since then? It seemed that economics profession through Mahbubul Haq was arriving. He then went to the UN, as you know, and did the Human Development Index, which is also very famous. But now I don't think we have the same effectiveness. So I thought about that, and I thought I'd write about that a little bit before I came to macroeconomics, which is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about research and policy. Then I'm going to use the macroeconomics to illustrate the issues. And I'm going to conclude with, hey, how should we think of moving forward? My contention is that since Mahbubul Haq's time, the economist community and our research has been totally ineffective in informing policy, or even generating a meaningful debate in policy. And I think this is the right forum to reflect at. This forum, the Pakistan Society of Development Economics, thanks to Nawab Haider Naqvi, has been meeting for 40 plus years now. It's supposed to be the largest gathering of economists in the country. It's supposed to be the American Economic Association of Pakistan. Now we can congratulate ourselves, as we did yesterday at the 60-year ceremony, but I always have to throw a spanner in the works. Sadly, we haven't begun that. We haven't become that. And that's something that we should look at. Why have we not become the association like the American Economic Association? We have 2 or 3 conferences in this country, and they all operate separately in silos. So, for example, I don't see people from Lahore here. I don't even see people from Karachi here. Lahore, oh, there's one person from Lahore. But you're not a part of the Lahore Mafia, so sorry. I discount that, but nevertheless. Okay, one person noted, duly noted. So the point is that why are we not coming together as a profession? And you recall, I wrote a paper on this in the PIDE a long time ago, on the economics profession of Pakistan, and I must say, those problems continue even today. We don't become a profession. Why? I'll put my model on the table. One is a profession is networked in terms of ideas. We don't have that. 2 is a profession is generating ideas and hypotheses, known for the ideas and hypotheses. We don't do that. We are a set of individuals who put out some research now and again, but the research doesn't talk to each other. There is no one research conversation like there is in many parts of the world. Like the American Economic Association has a research conversation going on in many areas now, not just one area. Take monetary policy, there will be a conversation. Take financial policy, there will be a conversation. You will find protagonists, proponents, etc., and you will have a huge discourse. So I think it's a very important thing to think about. I've also written a paper recently on how policy is made and the role of policy, etc. So I talk about that. Hey, to my mind, the model that I've read from the world is very important, and that comes into my book, which I'll talk about a little bit. The model is that the policy-making process is going on, but the policy-making process is always looking for ideas. It will look to academia for ideas. If academia can't give them ideas, it will look to donor for ideas. It will look elsewhere. It will even go on a visit overseas like Turkey and see what's happening and come and transplant it. They need ideas. Unfortunately, we are not giving them ideas. And the tragedy is they've got donors and whoever else to supply it. Sadly, the profession is missing, and that's something that's very important. Now, this book was referred to. I've written this book. It's lying outside. Please buy it. It's even discounted today if you buy it. It's 300 rupees, less than a cup of coffee. But the important thing is the book gives you many hypotheses to work on and to, work with. We've got 180 universities. We've got a large number of think tanks. Islamabad is brimming with think tanks. I went to this EOBI building yesterday and I found 4 think tank boards there. I didn't go in there, but the boards are there. So what's happening to the discourse? Where's the discourse? And there's a big problem. Now, Dr. Haque established a discourse. He established the 22 family discourse, the poverty curtain discourse, the HTI discourse. That discourse affects our policy. But today, what's happening? Our leaders, my thesis is, our leaders are still running on Dr. Haque's policies. As Keynes said, they're marching to a tune of a past economist. They're still marching to the same tune. They still want to get aid. They still want mega projects. They're still doing the same thing. Even though the world has moved on, all of us pay lip service to why nations fail. All of us pay lip service to all the new institutional stuff. But none of that falls into policy. And I think we have not mainstreamed it into a policy. That's something that we should also accept. Where is our thinking on that, and why are we not putting it on the table, right? But related to that also is the issue that the Planning Commission, which used to be the host of Mahbubul Haque and economists like that, Khalid Ikram, what is that? Kya tha ji wo? Javed Asfar, Javed Hamid, there's so many. It had a wonderful bunch of young economists who were really coming up, but then they left. Now the Planning Commission is dead. Let's face it, Planning Commission is nowhere. It's not doing much at all. Even the CDWP, PC1 process is broken. Why has that happened? All our processes are broken. The only thing that we do for the last 30 years is fund program after fund program. We've done about 15 or 16 fund programs. 25 out of the last 30 years are in fund programs. And not hopefully, but most likely we are heading into another fund program. I'm not saying that Ashfaq and Pasha, etc. saying it. I will not even say that we will, but chances are that we will. I hate predicting, so I won't predict. But the question is, there is no constituency for anything but the fund work. And what is the fund work? We'll talk about that. Government, in the meanwhile, is totally focused on brick and mortar. Build a highway, build this, build that, build that. That's it. Government can't think. Build universities. Universities without professors, highways without financing, everything that we are doing, then we go and borrow, and then we say, oh, state bank reserves have gone down. So that's the model. Unfortunately, we haven't critiqued it enough. Unfortunately, we haven't thought about it. Unfortunately, there's something else going against us. I don't know if Mahbubullah could have survived it or not. When Mahbubullah was here, they needed the planning commission, they needed him, they needed his ideas, the ideas were locally developed. Now there's far too much competition. There are about 50 donors out there. They have 10 times more money than the planning commission has. When I was in the planning commission, I used to tell them, look, you have all the money, I have nothing to give. So they commission all the research. All of you are working. How many people are working for donors here? Raise your hands. Not one. I can't believe it. Huh? Shahid, you're not raising your hand. Okay. How many donors here, by the way? Any donors here? Now, this is the other thing that I find very interesting. Why are the donors not listening to the premier research convention in Pakistan? That means they're also saying, hey, your ideas are not worth listening to. So there's no feedback to the donors. So they're setting up agendas without listening to us. And that's also very worrisome, and we should think about it. So Pakistani scholars, they're increasing. Ataur Rahman was here. He talked about how he's sending people over for PhDs. And yes, people are going abroad for PhDs. It's happening, right? But yet, the hypotheses and theses are not there, right? So unfortunately, we do all this stuff, and it ends up being a donor report. So we have tons of poverty studies. We have tons of studies on trade with India. We have tons of studies on various little things here and there. But energy, we hardly have any studies. Growth, we hardly have any studies, right? Institutional reform, we hardly have any studies. So that's a huge, huge issue, and we should talk about that. The domestic agenda appears to be a collation of international agendas, right? Or the concerns of headquarters of donors, but there seems to be no other domestic agenda. Sporadically, people write in newspapers like Shahid, Ishrat, etc. People write in newspapers, and they write about current stuff, but that dies down. In terms of research, very little comes out. But this is because our domestic institutions have come down dramatically, as well as, for example, key topics that are missing are, we have very little work on decentralization, we have very little work on governance, we have very little work, most importantly, we have no work on the budgetary process, on the government processes. Our budget process is totally broken, but the research doesn't know it. The most glaring example that I come across is the energy situation. We've lost 10% of GDP in energy. In 10 years, we've lost roughly about 40% of GDP in energy. Now, these calculations we need to harden. I'm not saying it's a firm calculation, but it's an important calculation. And we have no research on energy, and that's an important thing to think about. So the question is, if we are going to be a profession without ideas, without a conversation, and we should talk about how do we establish a conversation? A conversation is a set of citations, a set of hypotheses, a set of theses, a set of conversations with each other, where so-and-so's thesis is discussed, so-and-so's ideas are discussed, so-and-so's this is discussed. Like you have, for example, in the Friedman thesis on monetary policy, or the Keynesian thesis, the Hayekian thesis, etc. We don't have that in Pakistan. And that is something you, the profession, must think about. Hey, why not? Do we come here just for the food of ideas? So if there are no ideas, let's go to the food. Simple, right? So that's my preamble. Now, taking this, I go into macro. So, hey, this is where we are. We've got no agenda, clearly. Let's look at the harm this process does to macro. Now, what is the discussion in macro? The discussion in macro is very simple. You can read it in the newspapers. You can read it anywhere. We are probably going to come to another fund program. And the discourse of the donor is very simple. There's a beggar's curse that we suffer from. What is the beggar's curse? The beggar's curse is, hey, if it works, the credit goes to the donor. If it doesn't work, the fault is ours, because we didn't implement it right. Nobody cares about the design, right? Now the issue is, if you look at the fund program, what's going to happen in the coming program? Same thing that happened in the last program. right? Basically what will we do? We'll attempt to build reserves for 3 months. How will we build reserves? We'll attempt to cut the first domestic credit. After domestic credit, we'll cut the fiscal deficit. Once we cut the fiscal deficit, we'll think about the measures. What are the measures? We'll put in a tax here, a tax on this, a tax on that, a tax on that, because we need revenues, right? Then when it comes to the revenue, after we've done the revenues, we say, oh my God, we can't get more revenues. Okay, start cutting expenditures. How do we cut expenditures? Across the board cuts, random cuts. When that doesn't work, we say, okay, we'll privatize. Let's privatize this. But privatization doesn't happen. It's very difficult. We don't know how to do it. So we put it down on the table anyways. We won't do it. It doesn't matter. There'll be some talk of some structural reform like getting rid of SROs, etc., etc. As state bank independence is a common theme, pet theme, making the energy sector better, pet theme, but nothing happens on those. Those things are put down just for the sake of completing. All multilateral and bilateral institutions then gather behind the fund program and say, we've got to make it work, we've got to make it work. We make it work for maybe a year or 2 years, 3 years, sometimes less. But things go back to where they were. This has been happening for 30 years. Do we need to rethink, or should we continue to do the same thing? 30 years we've been doing this. How should we think about it, right? I think that's an important thing. I'll raise 4 points here which are very important, all of which are large research projects. I'm not going to deal with them in any serious level, but nevertheless, these are things that we should think about. First thing is, austerity is a new word that has come out after the 2008 crisis in Greece, Portugal, Spain, etc., where they are saying that the fund program has cracked the economy so hard, or in England, very important, the whole Brexit debate is based on austerity. What they're saying is that austerity has cut expenditures randomly, put taxes up, without any clear reason. The result is that they've done two things. They've slowed down growth, and they've slowed down infrastructure and social development. So it's a big debate in the West. Now, hey, should we look at it in Pakistan or not? I think we practiced austerity too long. Yet, there's no debate out here. I think we should have sessions on austerity. Perhaps the next conference should be on austerity. Because the way I look at it, our tax system is so random. We've got about 26 or 32 withholding taxes. Mobile phone tax, this bottle withholding tax, all kinds of school fees withholding tax. All these taxes are distortive, and all these taxes mean that even the poorest guy is paying income tax. Then the donors say, nobody's paying income tax. Hell, but the poorest guy is paying income tax too. Then we've got all kinds of other SROs and crazy. I won't go into the tax system. There's a lot of problems in the tax system, right? But more importantly, if you go to the police, I asked some police people, I asked some railway people, they say, hey, we have enough money to pay salaries, we don't have money to pay for operating expenses, right? With the result, the signal systems are going down, all kinds of other depreciation of assets is taking place. What does the depreciation mean? It means that by definition your growth will slow down. That's what austerity does. Austerity, like for example, Punjab University doesn't have money to employ more than half its professors, so half the positions are lying vacant because of budget reasons or whatever. So this is austerity. This is what austerity means, and I think we should look at it. Secondly, within austerity, I think we have too mechanical a way of looking at the budget. The budget debate, if you look at it, newspapers show it all the time, it's always numbers. And the first thing I learned in economics was numbers are meaningless unless they're relative. So unless we talk about ratios to GDP, it doesn't mean anything. If you've got tax minus revenues, it's kind of useless. But again, if we don't think of it in a dynamic sense, it's a meaning. So discussion is always, can we get to 5%? Can we cut this? Can we cut that? Can we get to, revenues up to this or whatever? We forget the fact that sustainability calculation requires taking into account growth as well as the relationship of growth to the real interest rate. And Peter Montiel and I have a paper on this. I've got some calculation here and there. I'm not going to go deeply into it. But I think the sustainable deficit calculation is again something that you guys, the kids here, must be doing on a regular basis and keep it in the debate because, hey, there's a lot of stuff that we have to look at, and the sustainable deficit calculation automatically takes you into growth. The solution to the debt problem is not to lower the fiscal deficit again and again. That's what we've done. The solution is not to raise taxes again and again. The most important part of the solution we never talk about, which is growth. And growth is the missing figure, the the Prince of Denmark that is missing in Hamlet is growth. We never talk about growth. Growth doesn't come into our discussion. We talk about everything else. We talk about stabilization, adjustment, central bank debt, inflation. Growth is missing because we think growth is something that is left outside. Why? Because we are still saluting the Mahbubul Haq model, which is that growth will happen through projects and aid. And that discourse has to change. We have to get beyond Mahbub. Much as I pay all the respect to him, we have to get beyond his time, because that was that time, this is this time. There's a lot of research in between, right? So my message to you is growth has to be front and central. And I tried to do that in the framework of economic growth, tried to do that in the PIDE. We had a growth conference. We had a conference on, we had cities, etc. We had a book on cities, etc. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about growth, and we need to think about growth, how growth will happen, what will happen to growth. And we know growth is not a hardware issue. Getting more and more infrastructure, we know, is not going to get you growth. Yeah, it's important. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it at all. Of course, it's a part of the problem. But the biggest bang for the buck, as I said, just think of why nations fail. Just think of so many other papers, North or whatever. The biggest bang for buck is domestic institutions and the role of the government. So I think the most important thing that we haven't challenged at all is the three topics: the role of government, governance, and what is fiscal policy, and how can we make it better. There are underpinnings of fiscal policy. I call fiscal arithmetic just looking at deficit minus taxation is equal to fiscal. That's fiscal arithmetic. That's just accounting. We need to look beneath, and that's very important, right? I mean, if you begin to think about what the government is doing, for example, we have to begin to understand, A, what the government is doing, and two, what do we want out of the government? What is governance? Now, let me give you, in box one, I've given you the way the donor looks at the government. This is from the World Bank report of 2016. The World Bank, what is it? Economic Update, 2016. And they give you an idea of what has been achieved in the 3-year program, and I've directly copied the quotes from there. And you can see what's happening. It's exactly some fiscal adjustment, some privatization, and some passing of some laws that come from the West or whatever. That's what reform is. I think, again, you as the economic community has to define what policy and reform is. We are too confused about reform. Putting a 10% tax on mobile phones is considered reform in our lingo now. Putting a tax on for example, water is considered reform. Getting the discos to putting a greater duty on disco prices or on oil prices is considered reform. I think, quite frankly, we have to move away from that. Reform and policy must be seriously considered. There is no reform unless we consider a serious change in the governance or the process or the system or the way we do things. It has to be a serious change in behavior, change in organization, change in setup. Just window dressing is not reform, and we should push for it. That reform is not just getting the prices right. Reform is not just, moving things here and there. Policy. Policy is not something that you write in the middle of the night or that the donor writes and you sign. Policy has to be based on research. Policy has to be well debated. Policy has to be thought out, and I can give you chapter and verse on this. Take the Dodd-Frank bill, for example, how it happened. Take the healthcare bill, how it happened. There is so much research that leads into it. There's so much discussion that goes into it. And we must agree that this is something that has to happen even in Pakistan. We can't do policy just without reform. On government, we must make sure the term governance is too loosely used. The term governance is very loosely used. We think governance is just putting the government somewhere. Or like in our standard economics, I'm sick of this. I used to make macro models all the time, and I used to put in G minus T. G minus T doesn't capture anything. Because we need to look beneath the G. We need to look beneath the tax T. The G, beneath the G is a whole system of governance, a whole bureaucracy, whole everything that sits there. And we have to figure out how it sits there. There's a whole regulatory structure, there's a whole policy-making structure, there's a whole service delivery structure, and we have to think about how they are separate and how they work. And here Ishrat's report on government performance is an important first step. And I think it needs a lot of review and discussion, and we should be doing that. There should be a lot of report. We did this in the framework of economic growth. We put out another set of ideas. There's a lot of debate. In this book, again, I've considered this a lot. I'm not saying any one of these things is God's own truth. In research, there is no God's own truth. In research, there's only a conversation, debate, and we must do that. And we must clarify. Projects are not policy. When the government is doing projects, they're doing projects. There's no policy in the government. Right now, I haven't seen any policy. Building metros is not policy. Building this or building that is not policy. We've got to come to policy. Where is the policy? But policy, when it's made without any consultation, without any research, because somebody just made it, we have to decry that and we have to come out. But then you have to come out and tell me what policy. Then you have to show me policy. If you can't show me policy, I'm sorry, what can I do? So where is the policy, for example? Ishrat's report, as I said, is there. Where is the reform of the civil service? We discussed that when I was here. We put out a book in it too. But PIDE now has done nothing on the civil service reform, for example. Or, for example, take the financial market reform. The SECP has gone inside the Ministry of Finance, gone outside the Ministry of Finance. Chairmen have come and gone, etc., but I don't see any papers on the SECP. Central bank independence. 3 governors resigned during Zardari's time. Governors changed randomly. Yet we've had 2 or 3 bills of the central bank independence. Yet do we see anything on that? So we have to begin to understand that policy and reform are still not on the table, whereas projects are hard on the table, and we are always looking for aid, and we are always looking for financing, and because we were searching for financing, look what happened. We've got a balance of payments hole, which we needn't have had we focused on policy. Right now, we've almost got about 6 billion of swaps and about 7 billion of international borrowing. I mean, it's a crazy mix. Why did we do that? And why has nobody looked at the size of the reserve, the composition of reserves and how they have grown? That again should be a part of our research. So, number of issues there that we have to think. But now I come to another thing where I come back to my book. I've also been thinking a lot like everybody. Like Asad gave the introductory lecture, which I think was very good. But I think like him, I've been thinking about it, or all reasonable people should be thinking about it, that in 2008, the world changed. There was a global economic crisis that kind of jolted us out of our chairs and told us, hey, there's something wrong. Because before 2008, Greenspan was taking bows everywhere because Greenspan was called the maestro. He had figured out how to do the policy, he could strum it, he could play it like an organ, and he was doing beautifully. And everybody thought Greenspan was, my God, what a guy. You know, we all sort of kind of worshipped him. Today, unfortunately, after 2008, Greenspan now is hiding away. You know, he doesn't even show his face because he even publicly admitted I was wrong. So guys, we have to wake up too. Economic policy is in a flux, and we should not be too married to our models. We got too married to our models. We got too married. When I hear evidence-based or this, that, etc., I kind of worry because, you know, I feel this is like becoming a religion. But I find something new has happened, which is remarkable, which is a new subject, complexity. And I've been thinking about what they're saying is instead of looking equation by equation, like if I built a macro model, very simply, I'd put in consumption function, investment function, GDP function, the BOP constraint, and the monetary constraint, and then some important export equations. I've got a complete model, and I can run it, and I've done it many times, and I can figure it out easily. But what you've got is you've got a model that is constant over time. Your parameters are based on history, and you're assuming history will not change, the world will not change, that the world will remain as, this guy says, North says, world will become non-ergodic. It will not change ever, it will remain constant. But the world changes. The world changes in front of us all the time. Sometimes it changes because an earthquake happens, sometimes it changes because another earthquake happens. Because Donald Trump comes in. When Donald Trump comes in, the model goes out of the window, the train is gone, it's already different, right? What complexity thing is saying is think systemically. Stop thinking in sectors. Think of the whole economy, think systemically. And instead of using calculus, what you used to do, or econometrics or whatever, think much more in terms of evolution. When you use calculus or econometrics, you're thinking only in terms of today. And you're simulating forward, but you're using today's history and you're truncating history. You're not even trying to use the whole history. Whereas complexity allows you to the whole history because you're using evolutionary concepts and you're looking at the patterns and you're seeing how they're evolving. So I won't go deeply into complexity. I will just say that it gives you a wholly different view of the way things are thought of. The second thing that's very important with importantly different in complexity is local models. The current model that we're using are thinking of homogeneous agents, and they're independent. Here we are talking of heterogeneous agents that are dependent. That allows you to build in all kinds of political economy. Who was talking about, Osman Qadir was talking about that Second thing that we have to move away from equilibrium. The current model, the model that I gave you, the 7-8 equation model, which we used to run a lot and used to always worry me, because it requires forced equilibrium. I used to simulate for 10, 20 years that was forced equilibrium over 10, 20 years. It remained in constant equilibrium, but the world may not be in equilibrium. So we are talking about adaptation and evolution rather than equilibrium, right? The third thing which is very important, which comes up every conference in Pakistan, so let me just make sure. It's neither government nor private sector. People love to say this. So you're talking about the private sector, this is the government, It's neither, it's not one or the other. Both have to go together. Both the government and the private sector have to go together. Our failing is we've never understood them, how they work together. We only think they can work in sharp contrast to each other. That's our failing. Complexity allows you to think of them as together, right? And the most important thing that comes out of complexity, which is very important, is that policy is no longer something that you dream up at top. The consultant thinks up and says, you know what, you should think about making sure that Usman sits here and Shahid sits there, and you should make sure that he washes his face and he washes his, whatever, and there were 20,000 policy matrices. Make sure that Shahid does his sums this morning, and make sure that Asad does his, whatever. I mean, that kind of a thing, where you tell people what to do, where you tell markets what to do, where you tell everything. We've seen that fail time and time again. It doesn't work. So policy has to be thought differently. Policy has to be thought as a nudge. Policy has to be thought as evolving bottom up. Policy has to be thought of something that the government is tweaking, not making. So you don't tell every kid to go to school. No, you can't make him go to school. He's not going to go to school. You have to figure out how to tweak his behavior to go to school, and therefore you must understand what he's doing. Now that's a very complex task. That's a very different. That means policy has to be led by research. That's where you guys come in. Very important. But do you have policy or not? Unfortunately, you don't. Unfortunately, you don't. Where is your policy? Where are these things? And I've thought about it, and I've built up kind of a model and worked with it in this book. I see about 5 or 6 different agents operating in the model, which are very different, whose interests are very different, and we have to talk about those guys. And then we have to figure out what moves the system. What moves the system is, of course, we all know incentives. What are the incentives? Incentives are not just wages. There are all kinds of incentives. What are the incentives? We all know rents, but what kind of rents? So we have to think about the rents. There are all kinds of rents that we can think about. For example, I argue one of the biggest rents that we've got in this system is the land. The land mafia is a very important way it works, and we can talk about how it does. Then we have to think about where the capture happens. There's a capture of government. There's a capture of regulation. There's a capture of the markets. Where do the captures happen? And once we begin to think of that, then we can begin to see, hey, how do you unravel all this? But the captures, and where is the geographical space it happens? Geographical space it happens in cities. So you have to begin to think about how to unlock the cities, but then you have to think about decentralization. So if you think about it even as a short thing, it all falls into place once you begin to think of it in a systemic fashion, and we can run these models on a computer and see how they work. It's extremely important that we do this well, and we understand complexity. Now, I'm not saying, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you junk all your traditional models, I'm not saying you junk econometrics, I'm not saying you junk macroeconomics, no. This is another tool. Just like your other tools, this is another tool. And just like any profession, we must play around with all our tools, develop new hypotheses, talk about them, approach things from this point of view, that point of view, different points of view, and see what we can achieve. So to conclude, what am I saying? I'm saying the macroeconomics is totally screwed up in this country because you have failed to play a role. It's left in the hands of the Ministry of Finance and a couple of people who are just winging it. They're just continuing Mabulak's model, and we need to move forward. And you need to help us move forward. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in Mabulak's model for the next so many years. I'm saying also that will not happen unless we change the way we do business. By we, I mean the economists, unless the public policy thinkers, the social scientists. I'm saying we need to change the way we think. Most important of all, we must build knowledge. Let's not have conferences for tamashas. Hey, we need to fill the panel, so, so-and-so is passing by, he does flowers, bring him in, so-and-so is passing by, she does garments, bring them in, so-and-so is passing by, she races cars, bring her in. That won't do. We have to be more focused. We have to build focused knowledge. How do we build it? We must make sure that we form citation communities. Just a very quick story. The other day, there was Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a famous astronomer who does this Cosmos series. He was on TV with Fareed Zakaria. And Fareed Zakaria asked him about climate change, and he said, some studies show that climate change is not real. So Neil deGrasse Tyson said this, look, you will always find an oddball study that's saying it's not real. But the large mass of science through citations tells us it's real. We have to accept citations as the only form of knowledge. One person doesn't matter. But if you're not forming a citation community, if you're not forming a policy community, then I'm afraid there's no knowledge. So for us to turn around to the policymaker and say, you don't listen to us, it's crazy. Who should the policymaker listen to? You haven't got a citation community. So the most important thing is to build a citation community. The second point I would say is, and within citation communities, ask questions, build knowledge. Relating to questions, the second point is important. For God's sakes, dare to question. Too many people are just tailing the donors and asking the same old questions. We need to ask different questions, even if we don't have the data, even if we can't apply econometrics. We must ask more questions, different questions, questions coming out of our experience. When I did the CGP, the Competitive Grants Program, many of you participated in that. I made sure that we went to all kinds of places, Swat and Jamshoro and Quetta, and we got very different questions from what I was expecting. In Islamabad, I thought of something. But the guy sitting in Swat told me, hey, there are some medicinal plants, I got to research those. I didn't know that. Another guy sitting up in the north said, hey, there's a bazaar here that does all kinds of illegal trades. Let's study that. Now, there's a important question we should do that. So dare to question. The third thing that I'm going to say is funders must listen. If the funders are not at conferences like this, if they are not prepared to listen, if they are not prepared to read these papers, we are in a very bad situation. As complexity says, there must be feedback. And we've got no feedback mechanisms now. We've only got somebody telling us. Funders. No, fundos is different. Fundos listen, funders don't. and the fourth thing I would say is we must develop more forums. Ishrat Sahab, you will agree with me, it's not one annual conference won't do it. My advice has been, Dr. Ataur Rahman, pata nahi chale gaye. My advice has been, and I've been trying very hard, every university must run a seminar series. Weekly seminar series, monthly seminar series. We must have more of a conversation. Without having a monthly or a weekly seminar series in every university, without networking, you will never form an idea community. And without an idea community, let's not waste our time. Forget it, let's stop doing this. जाके पानी बेच लें, को घर ही बना लें, बेहतर हो जाएगा, ठीक है ना? ये काम करने का तब फायदा है if you are able to develop some knowledge. If you can't develop any knowledge, if you're just going to throw papers into the waste bin कि मैंने लिख लिया अब चलो इसको फेंक दें, तो यार फिर तो फायदा कोई नहीं ना. तो sorry, it's a bit pessimistic, but you can either take the pessimistic message or you can take the other message that there's a challenge and that we see some way forward. How to build communities, how to do different conferences, how to do better things, how to ask better questions, how to do better macroeconomics, then I think it's not a pessimistic message, it's a positive message. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadeem. There were no surprises. It was as usual, typical Nadeemullah. And I would now open the floor for the discussants. I would request them to confine themselves to 10 minutes because we want question and answer participation from the floor. So the first speaker is Hamza Malik, who has come from Bangkok, works for UNESCAP, and was Director of the Monetary Policy of the State Bank of Pakistan. Hamza.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege and honor to stand here and talk in the Mahbubul Haque lecture in the presence of my professors here, in the presence of my seniors with whom I worked and learned a lot. My very first job interview after I graduated from Qaeda University was with Mr. Mahbubul Haque. It was a day-long interview. And at the end of the day, he said, if I have to ask you, what is one major problem of Pakistan's economy, what would you say? Mind you, by the way, Mahbubul Haque back then was running the Human Development Center. Me being a naive graduate simply said, I think it's current account imbalances. And he said, don't you think human development conditions are pretty weak in this country? We should work on that. And my response was, I think that is up to for sociologists to figure out. We economists should stay focused on the core issues. I was rejected for the right reasons. Made sense. It took me many years to realize, actually, as students and as economists, we tend to become very narrow. We are trained like that. Microeconomics, macroeconometricians. When we graduate, we start working in those areas and we lose perspective of the big picture. repeatedly. We are not exposed to history of our own country, of economic or otherwise. It used to be the case before, but a lot of students I interact or colleagues I talk to, they don't really go after that. I won't have the same energy, I guess, as Nadeem here, but I'll try to pick some threads that I think he highlighted. I don't agree that Mahbub ul-Haq's legacy can be defined or should be defined as that he left a macro policy which is brick and mortar based projects. It's a bit injustice to Mahbub ul-Haq. I think his legacy, as Nadeem himself started, is the development of Human Development Index, making economists think beyond expansion of economic output. So that's my very first remark. I'll say we need to go beyond that. As economists, we tend to measure economic progress of society as a whole as increase in GDP growth. This makes it very easy. There is consistency of methodology, data is available, you can compare your past performance, you can compare across countries. The problem starts, policymakers tend to start equating growth in GDP or expansion of economic output as increases in living standards across population, without actually defining it. To put it very succinctly, we tend to go with this notion, rising tide will lift all boats. Somehow the growth will trickle down to different segments of societies. I don't think so it has ever worked. I don't think so it works now. I don't think it will work in future. We need to move away from this excessive focus on economic growth. I know Nadeem was highlighting we need to focus on economic growth, but that's only a part of the story. I'll try to zoom out a little bit and I'll argue we need to bring in social and environment considerations directly up front when we talk about policy considerations and not segment them. This is macro domain. We talk about macro issues and then we'll worry about other issues. This approach of let's grow first and redistribute and clean up our environment later needs to change. A lot of criticism has emerged, especially after the 2008 crisis, on this approach. There are lots of criticism come forward. There have been proposals of alternatives put forward. The point is societal progress is much more than just, which I was simply saying, expansion of economic output. How do we define well-being of people? We have to acknowledge, and again I don't have to go in detail, the unprecedented pace of economic growth here in Pakistan probably, I cannot say unprecedented, but have been fairly high comparatively, or globally at least, has actually created, especially since the second half of the 20th century, enormous pressure on the social fabric of societies. One simple example is rising inequalities, whether income or opportunities. Somebody who has gone to a government high school in Gujarat or any small town, other small town, does not stand a chance actually, a very little chance of competing with those who have gone to Edison College, for instance. Those inequalities are entrenched in the system, they feed into the policy making, and that becomes a sort of elite capture over time. A large swath of societies are simply cut off from the entire process, what we call progress of societies, basically. It has, the way growth has taken place, economic growth has taken place, it has brought about dramatic changes in climate and biosphere. The associated increase in natural disasters is actually happening right in front of us. As macroeconomists, we can say, oh, this is something environmental economists are going to focus about. That's what I'm arguing. We don't need to. We don't have the luxury to go and take that route anymore. Just to be sure, economic growth will remain critical for economic growth, for overall development. But what I'm trying to say is the quality of growth has to become ever more important. Human welfare is best served with the pace and quality of economic growth intertwined. I won't define quality of economic growth in the interest of time here, but I'll be happy to share some specific ideas afterwards. To me, in a nutshell, the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals is a part of that, by the global community is probably the most clear indication to acknowledge that these challenges exist. It may be articulating a utopia, that what we want to be eventually in societies, but at least it's a global agreement, and that should encourage us to think on those lines and to promote a much broader concept of human welfare. This needs to become a narrative of our time. This needs to become a focus of research, as Nadeem was trying to encourage all of us. So how do we translate this consideration to reality? We need to change how we measure progress and welfare. We all understand that. How do we go about doing that? What kind of questions we need to ask? Is the economic growth creating enough sufficient and decent jobs? You look at the data, not really. Is the economic growth leading to commensurate increase in real wages? Again, you look closely at the data, not really. A lot of people are accumulating debt actually to keep up with the consumption-led growth. At the aggregate level also and the individual level. Countries are doing the same thing. It's essentially a rat race. You can say it's the curse of modernity. We have defined the ultimate objective of economic activity as pursuit of maximization of income and wealth and so on and so forth. And we're saying once we do that, then we're going to pay attention to those things. I'm going to earn a lot of money. Eventually, I'll spend time with my family and my wife and my kids, right? We have internalized this kind of approach. We need to think differently. We need to ask the right questions. How much emissions are produced? How much carbon emissions are produced per unit of growth? There may be some research out there. More needs to be done. That's what I'm highlighting. That I think is the Pakistan economists can pick up. I had a lot of details on the alternative measures of welfare. 2 minutes. I'll conclude in 2 minutes, maybe 3. Welfare methodologies I'm not going to show. My point I'm trying to simply highlight is there are alternatives that exist. OECD's framework for measuring well-being and progress is one example, which shows how to use the data, how to define this welfare. UN has done a lot of work, inclusive wealth indicator, that is out there. The question is, we should ask right questions, what kind of society we want. Let me give you a very direct and simple example, shedding light on macro policy, very briefly. When we talk, as monetary economists or working in a central bank, we talk about trade-offs between growth and inflation all the time. Central bank's loss function. Where does it come from? It essentially comes from a utility maximization exercise in the words of macroeconomists, right? What do we put in that exercise? Consumption. If you define the welfare criteria differently, we will get different policy trade-offs. We won't be bogged down in figuring out if we increase interest rates to inflation, it's going to damage growth because we are limiting a framework by definition, by construct. So that's what I meant. We need to zoom out actually and talk about policy and ask the right questions. Otherwise, we can keep debating. We still have a debate, I'm sure, in central bank whether growth should be the top priority or inflation should be the top priority. We threw in finance later on and say, oh, we should also talk about financial stability because prior to 2008, there was no finance in the macro model to begin with. So we are adding on these things as an afterthought, but we are not still there in asking the bigger and right questions. What kind of society we want? How do we deal with issues of plurality? How do we promote tolerance? Why they are not important issues for policymakers or public policymakers? Why can't economists talk and write about that? This is what is going to affect how societies are shaped. So why we're shying away from these kind of questions? We means, again, as economists. One last comment I wanted to make, and I'm really skipping for all the other comments. Two small things. One, I agree with Nadeem's conjecture. We definitely need to think beyond austerity. That is nonsense, put simply. Not just to really lift growth. A range of development priorities needs to be addressed, and state has to take the lead. Private sector will support, but state has to take the lead. They need resources for that. When you do the debt sustainability analysis, I think Nadeem was alluding to that briefly. It is much more than cutting down the fiscal deficit. There's a concept called fiscal multiplier, and it's a dynamic concept. We need to figure out if you are increasing fiscal spending, to which extent it's going to create growth, and it can be calculated. Our recent report at UNESCAP published last week, we actually did that analysis for the entire Asia-Pacific region. It turns out there is much space still there. The very concept of fiscal space are being defined on these lines now, and those kind of, that point I agree. A much more fundamental point than Nadeem raised, which is extremely important, and I'm sure my friend Waheed probably will pick up from there since he works for the World Bank, is 30 years we're in the more or less IMF program. We have been bailed out literally by 12 or 13 times, every 2-3 years in 25 years. I have been part of the government for 2 programs, negotiating them, and you always wonder exactly the same question, why we keep going back all the time? Why, as a whole, we haven't learned any lessons? What is missing over here? There is no sovereignty of policy making if you're in an IMF program at the end of the day. So we understand that also, and yet we don't learn our lessons. Why that is the case? I was going to go in the detail of that, but I'll leave you with a small thought. It's a cultural issue, and there is no political constituency for reform on those lines. We are pushing the can further down the road. Policy making is boiled down to quarterly targets. We are not asking the bigger questions. Why you want to be in a tight spot where you will be told what to do, what not to do? You can maneuver on the margin here and there, but fundamental questions certainly are going to allude. I'll skip the details. I think some speakers spoke yesterday also and today, and I wanted to mention that, and I'll stop on that remark. Technological disruption, what we normally call, usually nowadays being referred to as future of work. The pace at which these changes are taking place and the pace which way they are changing the societies and economies is tremendous. It's extremely rapid. There's a huge skill bias that is being created, is going to create, has created and will be creating more and more inequalities that is going to filter into a lot of social discontent. And we need to, this is what I was alluding to earlier, if we stay focused only on growth, we're not going to address those things. But they are happening right in front of us. We cannot change that. We can try and upgrade the skills, but during that structural transformation, state has to step in and say, okay, how they're going to take care of those things. That to me is a part of public policy making. That to me is an area that economists should worry about. We need to have a holistic picture and we need to raise big questions. I leave you with these thoughts. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Hamza. I now request Dr. Waheed from the World Bank, also an ex-State Bank, to make his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ishrat Hussain, Dr. Nadeem Ulhaq, fellow panelists, my teachers here, and fellow students and colleagues. Assalamu alaikum. So it's an honor to be sharing this stage with such eminent economists on the eve of late Dr. Mahbubul Haq lecture. I'm very grateful for that. So let me state up front that I agree on most of the things and the observation that Dr. Mahbubul Haq, Dr. Nadeem has made. I think his emphasis on informing policy making, taking trade-offs into account, is correct and necessary to take Pakistan to next level. His emphasis on the need of improved governance arrangement is critical in designing and implementing the economic policy. So I also cannot dispute his insights on the diminished role of Planning Commission, which is more focused now on project management than the policy, and the role of our key economic decision-making forums such as Economic Coordination Committee, as he has observed more closely than any one of us. And indeed, there is no dispute that growth should be the focus of economic policy in Pakistan, and to achieve this, deeper institutional reforms are warranted. And as Dr. Nadeem wrote in his paper, that we need a society which is creative and inclusive. How to achieve this? I think what is the role of research in achieving this outcome? As noted by Dr. Nadeem, that the indigenous research has not achieved a critical mass over the last 70 years. This brought Dr. Nadeem to the discussion on local solutions versus best practices advised by donors. I fully agree with his view on the futility of implementation of international best practices without tailoring these to fit the local requirements. And we need to find ways that similar demand arises from government and other stakeholders who do not seem to be demanding as much research to inform their policy making. And that's why some of the areas which are important and alluded by Dr. Nadeem and vital for overall national economic policy and growth are not covered in the research agenda. But who to blame? Donors or government? Government should be the largest consumer of indigenous research. Unfortunately, it is not the case. My personal experience in this regard is not very encouraging. There are pockets in the government which appreciate policy-oriented research and wants to undertake informed policy making. Nevertheless, this is an exception, not the rule. And I know all attitude is prevalent everywhere. Now, how to create demand for informed policy making in government? And this is the broader question, and Dr. Nadeem actually hinted it in his paper regarding the need for having deep public sector reforms. Unless there is demand, we will continue to ignore our researchers and academics. And that brings to the question of appropriate economic policy. And Dr. Nadeem has actually discussed a lot in his paper. So Dr. Nadeem criticized the IMF programs as these are not about growth. And that's true, as these programs are of short-term nature and are about restoring the macroeconomic stability. And we all agree that macroeconomic stability is a prerequisite, but may not be enough for growth. If a balance of payment crisis hits the country now, demand compression probably is important in the short term. But once stability is restored and we have breathing space, we need to focus on medium to long-term constraints which are degrading our growth. But as generally the case, once some semblance of stability is achieved, we go back to our old ways and stop necessary reforms, as these entail political cost. The precise reason why Pakistan was called a one-tranche country. We build some reserves and get out of program, and in few years we go back to IMF again. The real problem is that the medium-term reforms that we would need to put the macro on much stronger footing and avoid frequent crises are not being implemented. The fact that tax to GDP is still very low and many sectors in economy remain uncompetitive. And that's why we have the type of external pressures that we are observing these days. So we need a medium-term reform to address these issues, informed by local debates, academia, as mentioned by Dr. Nadeem. The problem for growth are not the IMF program, but all the required medium-term reform that are not being implemented to accelerate and sustain growth. I agree with Dr. Nadeem that some of the short-term measures to restore stability are ad hoc and not well thought of. For example, and Dr. Nadeem mentioned in his paper and he gave the example of taxation side, we have seen many taxes which are distortionary and negatively impact productivity. And Dr. Nadeem mentioned that there are roughly 20-25 withholding tax lines, but in fact there are roughly 80 withholding tax lines. So it's almost 80% of direct taxes are gathered through withholding mechanism. And many of the taxes are very distortionary. So for example, taxes on cash withdrawal, some taxes on school fees and internet. Why it has happened in the first place? Because government allows the policy to be designed by the tax collectors, whose performance is gauged by the revenue they collect, no matter how distortionary they are. So it is a broader question of incentives with the governance structure. So this is one fundamental question, and which brings me to the question of governance, which Dr. Nadeem alluded to. Do we have institutions that can incorporate the medium to long-term perspective in their objective function? And Dr. Nadeem focus on governance, and a stronger, more capable government is well appreciated. Ultimately, a lot of constraints boil down to governance. Governance is a huge topic and needs to be unpacked, and Dr. Nadeem did it. He talked about decentralization, civil service reform, and but I guess further unpacking may be warranted by the academia and students. This is a huge topic that should be actually looked at. And the realization that there are and governance reforms are the most difficult reforms that we have. As Hamza actually alluded to and asked about this question, donors usually shy away from these difficult reforms because there is a mixed kind of experience they have. But this does not mean that they are not badly needed. The others should go off for it, led locally, as suggested by Nadeem. Finally, I dare to have a small disagreement with Dr. Nadeem on his assertion that Dr. Mahbubul Haq may have stifled if he was alive today due to large donor presence. In 1970s, Dr. Mehboob Haq served as the chief economic advisor to Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank. There, he influenced the World Bank's development philosophy for several decades to come. Dr. Haq helped convince McNamara that development should focus on raising living standards and that poverty alleviation could be a cause rather than a consequence of economic development. This view was embraced by the World Bank for many decades to come. Had he been alive today, probably he would have influenced our lives in many other ways. Thank you very much.
Our last panelist is Mr. Wasim Shahid Malik, who is the State Bank Chair, Professor at University of Balochistan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's indeed a great honor to be here in Mehboob Haq lecture as discussant on paper presented by Dr. Nadeem Haq, my mentor and great economist with influential ideas in Pakistan. I have a few comments on the paper. Next. The first comment. I totally agree with Dr. Nadeem that the number of research papers in Pakistan has significantly increased over the last decade. But sadly, this research earned promotions for university teachers and occupied library shelves or computer hard disks, but didn't influence the policy making, especially in the area of macroeconomics. Researchers with dozens of papers do not participate in debates on the issues related to their area of research. In fact, if one looks at the recent inflation of the data-driven research in Pakistan, the number of research papers seem negatively correlated with the critical thinking. To improve, now what we can do in this regard, to improve the situation, there is a dire need to write textbooks, putting local context at the center. For example, for most of the Pakistani students, A. Hamid Shahid is the top ranked or the only economist in Pakistan. By the way, this I came to know when I first visited University of Balochistan. Why? Because he has translated economics textbooks into Urdu. But unfortunately, most of such books are outdated. For instance, according to these books, every rupee issued by State Bank of Pakistan is still backed by 30% gold. And State Bank's power of money creation is limited by gold reserves, and students have no idea of sovereign money. Another issue in this regard is the incentive structure faced by Pakistani researchers, especially in the universities. Researchers are, after all, people who respond to incentives. For me, Dr. Nadeem's paper is better than 100 papers which, without any appropriate researchable question, take data on few variables, apply standard econometric techniques, and publish in any HEC recognized journal. But according to the evaluation criteria of university teachers, those 100 papers can promote 10 assistant professors to associate professors. But Dr. Nadeem's paper is of no value. Why? It's a piece of conference proceeding. Now, regarding the austerity measures, the paper rightly mentions that Pakistan has been a victim of deficit hawks for the last 3 decades. And policies of deficit doves and deficit owls are not even discussed in this country. Even if you look at the latest report of IMF regarding Pakistan, IMF emphasized the need for stronger fiscal consolidated efforts. The issue at hand is concerned with targeting fiscal outcomes versus economic goals. The sound public finance theories prescribe targeting fiscal outcomes even at the cost of economic goals, at least in the short run. But according to Abel Lerner's functional finance theory, The fiscal outcome like fiscal deficit or public debt as a percentage of GDP for a sovereign government is not a useful target for policy making. Rather, what should we do? The policy ought to target in important economic goals such as full employment, price stability, poverty alleviation, environmental sustainability, and the overall standard of living. Historically, tax policy in Pakistan remained focused on achieving only one objective. And what is that? Revenue maximization. If we go back in the history, Beardsley Rummel, who chaired the US Federal Reserve in the 1940s, wrote two important papers on the role of taxes. One, taxes for revenue are obsolete. This was in 1940s. And tax policies for prosperity. He identified 4 objectives of tax policy, and interestingly, taxes for revenue generation is not one of them. He suggested setting tax rates to achieve the government's fiscal outcome, consistent with only one objective, and that is full employment. And Dr. Nadeem has talked about arbitrary tax increase and expenditure cut in Pakistan to achieve fiscal outcomes. He emphasized that such steps were taken without looking at the effects of those policies on economic goals. I want to add one more thing here. It's not only across the board expenditure cut that remained in practice in Pakistan and that negatively affected economic and social outcomes. Rather, priorities in the budget revision are much more important and worth looking at. If you look at the data, here is the reality. What we have been doing. For example, this is the example of budget revision of Punjab in the fiscal year 2014 and 15. Look at the priorities of the budget revision. That we have negatively revised budget for all the important sectors including education, special education, social welfare, women development, literacy, labor and human resources, health, agriculture. But for Governor Secretariat, we did not revise the budget. And for Provincial Assembly, we revised the budget in the upward direction. So these are our priorities. So what happened in this, due to these actions, what happened is look at the Global Competitiveness Index of 2016 and 17. Pakistan ranks 122 out of 138 countries overall. And for innovations, we are at 75th position and India at 29. Now, regarding the growth issue, Dr. Nadeem put forward that in Pakistan, we hardly had a dialogue on growth. At least for the last 3 decades, we have been practicing stabilization policies in Pakistan without caring about growth trajectory. And here is the result. The growth potential is declining over time, and we cannot sustain the desired level of growth of 8% and above, even not for 2 consecutive years. Then, Dr. Nadeem cited twice A. Smuglu and Robinson's work, which emphasized establishing inclusive political and economic institutions with farmer ranked at the top. There is some research available in Pakistan on how to make inclusive economic institutions. We can see, for example, Planning Commission Framework 2011 and Nadeemul Haque's study of 2017. But again, I want to add one more thing, that we need more multidisciplinary research on how to make inclusive our political institutions. Because without enabling political environment and appropriate legal institutions, any sort of economic reforms would not work. Okay. Then the paper puts growth on top of the policy dialogue, which should be there by all means. But it doesn't explicitly emphasize fair distribution of increased size of the cake. Growth strategy should be such that it doesn't encourage unfair distribution of resources. As Angus Deaton put it, we have to make sure that those who have escaped do not protect their position by destroying the escape routes behind them. So there should be at the top top of the priorities. We have to worry about this because the successful countries, according to Ace Muglu and Robinson's work, the countries which have sound political, economic, and legal institutions were unable to have fair distribution of resources. For example, look at the Ace Muglu and Robinson success story and the America's top 1% resources. That 18% of the income is going to top 1%. And regarding capital, even 40% of the whole capital or wealth is occupied by the top 1%. Now in this we have to make a choice as a society, as a nation, that we should learn from the international experience, and we have to make a choice from these three positions, that we go for equality, equity, or the reality, which is unfortunately and sadly the international best practice. Thank you.
You have heard the speaker and the panelists, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions in your mind, so I'll open the floor for questions. I'll encourage the students to ask questions because I think that is the most important thing, that we should encourage our students to be challenging the conventional wisdom and be inquisitive in asking questions. So there.
Sir, I'm Yasin Ayaz from PIDE's Public School of PIDE School of Public Policy. नदीम उल हक साहब ने कहा कि क्वेश्चन करें. सर अर्ज़ ये है कि इकबाल ने कहा था कि गला तो घूंट दिया अहले मदरसा ने तेरा, कहाँ से है आवाज़ ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह. हमारे स्कूलों में जो कि पब्लिक स्कूल्स हैं, वहाँ बचपन में ही बच्चों से ये किया कहा जाता है कि ख़बरदार सवाल नहीं करना वरना तो मार पड़ेगी. अब कहाँ से कोई सवाल करे? थैंक यू सो मच सर. सर मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि इस कल्चर को हम कैसे मज़ीद प्रमोट करें ताकि सवाल करने का जो एम्बिशन है वो मज़ीद तरक्की करे. थैंक यू सो मच.
Questions? Other students, please. I used to tell my students, there is no question which is a stupid question. So every question is a wise question. So please do ask questions. That's the best way of learning.
My name is Muhammad Adnan. I'm a student of Business Economics. My questions to Dr. Nadeem Ul Haq and the panel as well, because in most of the researchers and most of the speakers have said that there is an implementation issue in Pakistan. But last week, Dr. Nadeem Ul Haq said that there is not such an issue of implementation in Pakistan, that the government, if willing to, can implement anything. So my question is, what's the confusion in between? That he said last week that there is no implementation issue, but the speakers and researchers are continuously saying that the implementation issue. So what's the dilemma inside?
Anybody else? Don't be shy. Girls, where are girls? They're very bright.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a student of many teachers here, so I deserve the right to speak. Actually, Nadeem Saab talked about the right set of incentives. I have completed my doctorate recently. I do ask a question for myself, why should I do research? If we see the right set of incentives, even at the Conference of Global Economy, Ahsan Iqbal is the chief guest. In every conference gathering, even at the professors' gatherings, always the ministers or the bureaucrats are the chief guests. So I don't find the incentive to be a very, very well-reputed professor. I find incentive in becoming a bureaucrat or a minister because they are valued far higher than a prestigious professors, in my opinion. So how do you define this?
I have a question from Dr. Wasim's slide that he previously showed to us, that the priority list related to the expenditure revision data was representing that education, which must be the most top ranked priority in the budget setting, or like whenever the budget is being allocated on various heads of the like health, education, and so why the education and health are put as a last priority. And I have been observing since 2 days that various policymakers and practitioners are delivering various lectures, but they are not focusing on these type priority lists. Why is the gap between the policymakers and the practitioners?
Nadeem, all the questions are to you. So please.
Thank you. देखिए जी, आपने पूछा रिसर्च के इंसेंटिव्स का और मिनिस्टर्स का. आई थिंक आई एग्री विद यू कि कुछ कॉन्फ्रेंसेस यस ऑफ कोर्स होनी चाहिए, बट काफ़ी कॉन्फ्रेंसेस होनी चाहिए जहाँ के रिसर्चर्स एक दूसरे से खुद बात करें. जैसे कि मैं बात कर रहा था अमेरिकन इकोनॉमिक एसोसिएशन में कोई मिनिस्टर नहीं आता, कोई वडेरा नहीं आता. तो हमने जब PIDE में थे हमने बहुत कॉन्फ्रेंस ऐसी कराई थी. एक कॉन्फ्रेंस कराई थी जहाँ हमने बुलाया था इमरान खान को, बुलाया था, सबको बुलाया था. एक कॉन्फ्रेंस की थी, बाकी कुछ 5-6 कॉन्फ्रेंस की जहाँ हमने किसी को नहीं बुलाया, सिर्फ रिसर्चर्स को. तो वो भी ज़रूरी है, बट देयर इज़ अ कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ थिंग. बट आपका जैसे सवाल का सेंट्रल पॉइंट वो बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट है कि रिसर्चर्स को इज्जत मिलनी चाहिए. वो कैसे मिलनी चाहिए, बड़े तरीके होते हैं और वो हमें डिबेट करना चाहिए, बात करने चाहिए कैसे रिसर्चर्स को, अच्छे प्रोफेसर्स को इज्जत मिलती है. बहुत ज़रूरी बात है और इस पे बात होनी चाहिए. दूसरा जो क्वेश्चन की आप बात करें, क्वेश्चन कल्चर की बात करें, यार क्वेश्चन कल्चर, I agree with you, it's very difficult. But here, this is what I'm trying to do. Let's have a question culture. Let's talk about it. Question culture happens when we have universities, seminars, वगैरह. Unfortunately, वो AGC नहीं मानती, आपके वाइस चांसलर्स नहीं मानते. But I think, I hope all of us can push कि जी हर यूनिवर्सिटी में इशरत साहब वर्ल्ड बैंक में इनसे पूछे कितने सेमिनार्स होते थे रोज़, वहाँ महीना छोड़ दो, रोज़ कोई, मेरा ख्याल कितने होते हैं, 100-200 होते होंगे, ठीक है ना जी. तो रोज़ होते थे, तो यहाँ भी होने चाहिए रोज़, मेरा ख्याल है. दैट्स इंपॉर्टेंट. जब होगा तो खुद ही क्वेश्चन कल्चर बन जाएगा. जब वो बार बार बैठेंगे, बार बार कुछ करेंगे और आपको पता होगा सवाल उठाना अच्छी चीज़ तो बन जाएगा. इम्प्लीमेंटेशन का इशू है अदनान, आई स्टैंड बाय दैट. इम्प्लीमेंटेशन का कोई इशू नहीं है. इन्होंने मेट्रो बनाने तो बना लिया ना, इन्होंने जब LNG लानी थी तो ले आए ना. तो इनको जो चीज़ समझ आती है वो कर लेते हैं. मसला हमारा है कि हम इनको समझाते ही नहीं कि रिफॉर्म इंपॉर्टेंट क्या है. वो डॉक्टर महबूब हक का मॉडल जो उनसे का प्रोजेक्ट करें, एड लेके आए, वो तो वो कर लेते हैं. अब हमारा काम इनको समझाएं कि भाई रिफॉर्म क्या होता है और कैसे करते हैं. हमने रिफॉर्म भी नहीं डिफाइन किया. रिफॉर्म हम सोचते हैं सिर्फ प्राइस बढ़ा देना, वो बात सही नहीं है. बाकी तीनों डिस्कशंस ने इक्विटी पे बात की. मैं देखें इक्विटी आई एम नॉट डिनाइंग एट ऑल, इक्विटी होनी चाहिए, बट अगर ग्रोथ होगी तो इक्विटी, अगर कुछ और आपकी इंस्टीट्यूशंस ठीक होंगी, सब कुछ इक्विटी भी होगी. एंड मैं ये नहीं कहता उसको इग्नोर करें, ज़रूर करें, देखें, बड़ी अच्छी बात है. क्लाइमेट चेंज के मेनी इशूज़, बट वी डोंट वांट टू बी सो ब्रॉड कि बात ही ना हो सके. सेंट्रल पॉइंट ये कि पहली चीज़ हमें ग्रोथ पे तो फोकस करना है ना. हम ग्रोथ पे फोकस ही नहीं कर रहे पिछले 10-15 साल से, बल्कि ज़्यादा शायद. हमारी ग्रोथ गिर रही है, वसीम ने चार्ट में दिखाया था, बड़ी अच्छी चार्ट है. ग्रोथ हमारी गिर रही है, लॉन्ग टर्म ग्रोथ गिर रही है. एंड दैट्स अ सैड थिंग विच शुड बी अ सब्जेक्ट ऑफ मच रिसर्च. कम से कम 50 बंदों को यहाँ उस पर पेपर करना चाहिए कि क्या हो रहा है. फिस्कल मल्टीप्लायर की बात बिल्कुल सही है, फिस्कल मल्टीप्लायर की बात सही है, बट आई वुड आर्ग्यू हमजा कि फिस्कल मल्टीप्लायर आपका इस मिलियो में जो कम्पिटिटिवनेस की पोजीशन है, जो गवर्नेंस की पोजीशन है, हमारा फिस्कल मल्टीप्लायर अच्छा नहीं निकलेगा. मैंने एक चीज़ कोट की है पेपर में भी, मुस्लिउद्दीन एजाज गनी का पेपर है और भी किसी PIDE के एक और बंदे ने अच्छा पेपर किया हुआ है, पब्लिक सेक्टर इन्वेस्टमेंट और ग्रोथ पर. पब्लिक सेक्टर इन्वेस्टमेंट ग्रोथ इन फैक्ट इज कमिंग आउट एज नेगेटिव इन द लॉन्ग रन, विच इज़ काइंड ऑफ बिजार. ठीक है, एंड वी शुड थिंक अबाउट इट. बाकी जो प्रायोरिटीज़ की चार्ट वसीम दिखाई दी, इट्स अ वेरी गुड चार्ट. देयर नंबर ऑफ चार्ट्स लाइक दिस. आई थिंक ऑस्टेरिटी पे और जो बजट आउटकम्स हैं इन पे बहुत काम करने की ज़रूरत है और हमने काम किया ही नहीं इन चीज़ों पे. लेट्स टेक अनदर सेट ऑफ क्वेश्चंस.
Thank you. I'll now be very brief because the time is over. So I will, in terms of a debate which the speaker has challenged, I'll agree with him on most of the points, particularly on governance and institutional reforms. And my forthcoming book, which is coming out at the Karachi Literary Festival, is a analysis, evidence-based research done at Woodrow Wilson School, where we have come out that the variable which explains the decline of economic growth in Pakistan is the institutional deficit. So you will come across, and I think this is something I agree with him. Second, I think he has not emphasized Mahbubul Haq's later work and Paul Romer's work, where endogenous growth is actually driven by the human resource development. And human resources is a very potent factor. The old growth model of capital and labor is no longer relevant, and the growth, if you bring in human resource development as one of the major factor of production, will also lead to an equitable distribution at the end of this. So I have a different take on the growth. I agree with him on the growth, but I would like to introduce in the equation the question of the human resource. I think the model, which is really still basic, is that it is the combination of investment, institutions, and incentives which drives an economy. So projects per se are a vehicle for investment, either by the public sector or the private sector. Where I disagree with him is that he emphasizes austerity. This country has been wasting its resources and has been subsidizing unproductive activities. My own calculations of the subsidies which go for gas, electricity, irrigation water, railways, and public sector enterprises is that this is almost 1 trillion rupees per year. What kind of austerity are we talking about? This is what the major issue is. It is not, Pakistan has never been austere, it has been generous. And as Wasim pointed out, when it comes to unproductive expenditures, we are very austere, but when it comes to the productive expenditure and efficient use of resources, we are very austere. So I think that is the nuance I wanted to introduce. Finally, I think we have a problem in this country. We have too many chiefs and very few Indians. Every economist wants to be the leader. He wants to cite himself and his own work, and we can't work as a team. And research today is a teamwork. And that, I think, is our national psyche and national culture. And it is reflected in our own research field also. So let us give the message to the youngsters that one individual cannot move the mountains, but if you have thousands of you working together, you can do this. Please work as a team, get your egos out, you will get the credit ultimately. Thank you very much, and I want to thank Nadeem Haq and the panelists on your behalf for an excellent discourse today. Thank you very much.
Sir.
Then, sir, let me just, I could have said many things, but about education. People are not employable in this country. But about education, just a personal experience, I go and collect fresh milk every second day from some Gawalas here in E11. And I met their young son, he's in class 14. He goes to a public school, a private school. He studies art studies, Islamiyat, history, geography, science, and so on. So I said, what do you study in history? He says, Ayub Khan and Arifa Karim. Hello? Then I said, do you know Mahmud Ghaznavi? You know what his answer was? Which sector does he live in? That is the state of, how can you expect good economy, good economics, or good science, good education, good policy making, if that is the level of education? Thank you.
As a little token of appreciation, I would like to call Dr. Ishrat Hussain to present the souvenirs. Firstly, I would like to give the souvenir to Dr. Nadeem Haq. Now Dr. Hamza Ali Malik. Now Dr. M. Waheed. Now Dr. Wasim Shahid Malik. Now I would like to call Vice Chancellor PIDE Dr. Asad Zaman to present the souvenir to Dr. Ishrat Hussain. Thank you everyone. We will continue this session after 30 minutes, sharp 4 o'clock. Inshallah.